2014. Well, the government's Constitution Advisory Panel has been travelling around the country since February, and this Wednesday is the closing date for public submissions. Soon, I'll be talking to the co-editor of the Māori Law Review, Dr. Carwyn Jones. But before that, let's look back at the review and hear what Māori have to say about the prospect of a New Zealand constitution.
Are you aware of the Constitution Review?
No, I'm not aware of it.
Kātahi anō ka whakapuakitia e te rōpū tōrangapū Māori me nā hīna rā ka arotake hoki rātau I te tāhuhu ture o te motu.
Minorities need to have a voice within the Constitution.
Creating a system that will foster Māori.
This is a good time to stop and ask, what are your aspirations for New Zealand society going forward?
Engari hei tā te rōpū arotake Māori e kore tērā e whakaauahai ngā whakaaro me ngā wawata o te iwi.
Mā reira, me tīmata mai tērā kaupapa I runga te triti.
Mena kai reira he constitution ko hakamarama wenei tūmomo āhuatanga katoa.
We weren't all born equal.
It could actually have negative consequences.
Whawhai tonu no te mea. Hore kau he constitution.
Kāore he hāngaitanga tō tēnei kaupapa ki e tihi o tātou.
Ngā tātou hōpāke e kuarena. Ki tanga tātou te constitution, ana kei reira hoki rā, kāore kore wetai kore o pāna ki ngā rau.
For all New Zealanders, not just Māori.
Well, we cross live now to Dr. Carwyn Jones in Wellington. Kia ora, thanks for joining us this morning.
Kia ora.
You're not entirely happy with the process the government's undertaken. Why is that?
Well, I think it's just too limited. It's too constrained, really, to provide for effective constitutional change. I think what really would have been nice to see would have been a discussion first about the kind of values that we want to see underpinning our constitution, and then having a look at, well, what are the mechanisms that might give effect to that.
How would a discussion have been carried out in the way that you'd have liked to have seen?
Well, I mean, you might want to look at the work of Aotearoa Mātike Mai, which is an independent constitutional working group which I've had some involvement with, which is led by Moana Jackson and Margaret Mutu. And the process that they've undertaken has been one of starting from the basis of looking at what are the values that we want to see underpinning our constitution. And just to give an example of the kind of different perspectives and the different scope of those two reviews, the Aotearoa Mātike Mai and the government one. So the government, for example, is looking at what's the place of the treaty in our constitution, whereas Aotearoa Mātike Mai are looking at how can we build a constitution which is based on the Te Tiriti o Waitangi and our other values and tikanga.
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is one assumes that our current constitution and the institutions that we have are effective, are working well, provide for good accountability and public participation, and that really we're just looking at making some changes around the edges. Whereas what Aotearoa Mātike Mai are looking at is thinking about actually what is it that we want our constitution to do? How do we want the exercise of public power to look in Aotearoa in the 21st century and beyond? And then figuring out, well, what are going to be the mechanisms that can give effect to that.
So what importance should the treaty have in a constitution? I mean, should it be that any piece of legislation has to comply with the principles of the treaty, for example?
Well, for a start, I would like to see us actually start to move away from this idea of the principles of the treaty, because I think that waters down the actual content and the agreements that were made in the Treaty of Waitangi. But I think what we need to think about is how to make sure that the Treaty of Waitangi is part of the basis of our constitution. So whether that means having it sort of entrenched in a written constitution, I'm not entirely sure, but what I do know is, well, what I think is that we ought to have it in a central place in a way that influences and guides the way public power is exercised in Aotearoa.
Okay, well, let's just consider the first notion then, entrenching it. What might that look like? I mean, could it lead to, for example, a separate Māori parliament?
Well, those are all the kind of mechanisms that you could look at, but I don't think we've actually had the discussion yet about what are the values that we want to underpin our constitution. So, do we want to have a constitution which is based on the partnership set out in Te Tiriti? And if we do, then we can think, well, how do we give effect to that partnership? Does that mean having a separate Māori parliament? Does it mean having? I don't know that it necessarily means having a parliament as such. We might have different ways of organising. We might think about ways of giving more autonomy to our hapu, for example.
What would you like to see?
Well, the message that we're hearing in Aotearoa Mātiki Mai in our work is that very much people are keen to see the autonomy and independence of hapu reflected in a new constitution. So one of the ideas that people have talked about is maybe that we have an assembly which is much more like a United Nations style assembly, where in the United Nations states retain their own individual autonomy, but they come together and they make agreements on matters that affect them all. Now, we could see the same sort of thing operating in terms of a United Nations of Māori, of hapu and iwi coming together, retaining their own autonomy and independence, but coming together for matters that affect everyone.
What do you make of Winston Peters' comments that this isn't a serious constitutional review and taxpayers of all races will face decades of expensive, politically correct, culturally sensitive, obfuscated mumbo-jumbo?
Well, there are a whole lot of things in that comment that I disagree with, but one part of it that I do agree with actually is that this isn't really an effective constitutional review because it is so constrained by its limited terms of reference and because of its kind of political nature of its origin, really. So I'd agree that we actually need to undertake a much more serious constitutional review.
Be one of the rare times you would agree with Winston Peters, I imagine. Who should be leading the charge on this then? If it's too politicised, who should be leading this?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, and you might think about, well, maybe this is something that could come within the sort of work of the Human Rights Commission. It could even be something you might think that the Waitangi Tribunal was skilled to do if it was given the resources to undertake something like that. So really what we'd be looking for would be a body that is independent of government, independent of politics and politicians.
And then you've got the age-old challenge of engagement. How do you get people to engage?
Well, that's really all about making sure people understand how these decisions, how these constitutional matters affect their everyday life. You know, when you talk to people about constitutional issues, their eyes sometimes start to glaze over a little bit.
Well, that's exactly right, and you know what, we've got to wrap very soon. So just very quickly, I mean, what do you say to Māori to engage them in this process?
Well, the interesting thing is when you start to talking about Māori, about this is about decisions and about the exercise of public power, Māori already know the frustrations that they have with not being effectively represented or feeling like they're participating fully in public life and in the government institutions that we have. So they very quickly have thought about that discussion and are very quickly part of the conversation.
All right, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your time. That's Dr. Carwyn Jones, co-editor of the Māori Law Review there.